Recall that an inverse variation equation is defined by xy equals k, where k is the constant of variation. Sometimes you'll be asked to graph an inverse variation equation, and here's an example of how you would do it. So let's say we need to graph the equation xy equals 4. To make this a little bit easier to graph, I want to solve it for y. So I'll divide both sides by x and end up with y equals 4 over x. This gives me the ability to choose values of x, plug them in, and then figure out what y is. So I'm going to want to make a table of values with an x column and a y column. Notice that the values of x that I choose, I'm going to take 4 and divide it by that number. So let's pick some numbers like 8, 4, 2, 1, 0, and then let's do some negative numbers as well. -1, -2, -4, and -8. The values of x that you choose will depend on what your k, what your number on top, or your constant of variation is. So for example, you don't want to choose something like 3, because then y is going to be 4/3, and it's hard to graph 1 1/3. So let's plug in our values of x. So when x is 8, y is 4 over 8, or 1/2. 1/2 is actually not that difficult to graph. When x is 4, 4 over 4 is 1. When x is 2, 4 over 2 is 2. When x is 1, I have 4. When x is 0, I have 4 over 0. Remember, you can't divide by 0, so that's going to be undefined. So we'll see what happens when we get close to 0. When x is -1, y is -4. When x is -2, y is -2. When x is -4, y is -1. And when x is -8, y is a -1/2. Now let's graph those points. So when x is 8, y is 1/2, which is right about there. Try that again. Okay. When x is 4, y is 1. When x is 2, y is 2. When x is 1, y is 4. And I probably should have done x being 1/2. When x is 1/2, it's actually going to give me a value of 8 up here. Get that right there. So you're going to have a graph that looks something like this. Notice that as my x gets bigger, it gets very close to the x-axis. And as my x gets smaller, it heads up this way and heads towards the y-axis. Let's see what happens on the negative side. So when x is -1, y is a -4. And actually, I could even have done a -1/2, which would give me a value of -8. When x is -2, y is -2. When x is -4, y is -1. And when x is -8, y is -1/2. And so that gives me a graph that looks like this. Notice that as my x gets smaller, the graph approaches the x-axis. As my x approaches 0 from the negative direction, my y gets very small. So an inverse variation graph is always going to look something like this, with a curvy thing like this in one quadrant and another curve in the opposite quadrant. Sometimes you'll end up with a curve in the second quadrant and another curve in the fourth quadrant. You'll see examples like that in your homework.